Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CalCASA. So your team from Prevent Connect here today is myself and my colleague Tori Vandalin. Tori, thank you so much for being here. Tori's going to handle a lot of our tech support issues, and we'll be giving you a lot of links in the text chat. I wanted to say, so we had, so this is the second session in a three-part series, and we were not able to have Eb Brown from Just Beginnings Collaborative be on this web conference today. But we do have a message that Eb recorded for everyone that we are going to provide you a link to so you can listen to Eb's message and get a little bit more information about Just Beginnings Collaborative. If you have questions about Just Beginnings Collaborative, or I'm going to call it JBC from here on out, please let us know, and we will make sure that those questions get to Eb. But, you know, again, I mentioned this is the second web conference in a three-part series featuring fellows and organizational grantees from Just Beginnings Collaborative. And for those of you who aren't familiar with JBC, I want you to know that it's a fund dedicated to ending child sexual abuse. And so in 2016, JBC brought together an inaugural cohort of fellows and organizational grantees from across the nation who are all dedicated to ending child sexual abuse. And so today we're really excited and honored to be able to hear from 3 of those JBC fellows. And we're going to be led in a conversation to identify strategies that cultivate a culture of survivor healing and leadership as a prevention strategy. We're going to talk about why it's important to center the voices and expertise of adult survivors who are LGBTQIA people of color. We're going to learn about adult survivors who work with other survivors and people who have committed sexual harm while also centering healing and accountability. And then engage in a discussion about the possibilities and pitfalls of centering adult survivors. And then finally, discuss key breakthroughs in the movement to end sexual violence that have come about really thanks to and because of survivor leadership. So those are our objectives today. I'm really excited to just give you a preview of the guests that you'll be hearing from. So again, Eb Brown, unfortunately, is not able to join us, but we do have a message from Eb. We are going to be joined by Aisha Shahida Simmons, Anita Swarin, and Sonia Shaw. And I'm going to introduce you individually to each of our guests. So also, we do have, Eb did a brief overview of Just Beginnings Collaborative on the first web conference, so we'll give you a link if you wanted to check that out. But I did want to, as we get started in our conversation today around adult survivors as movement leaders, I want to remember a reflection that one of our guests from our first session that happened 2 weeks ago posed, and that was from Tashmika Turok of the Firecracker Foundation. And Tashmika asked the reflection in our first session, how do you end child sexual abuse if you create a movement that silences survivors and or makes survivors invisible? And so I wanted to really bring that reflection into this conversation today as we hear from Aisha and Sonia and Amita. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our first guest. Aisha Shahida Simmons is an award-winning Black feminist lesbian documentary filmmaker, activist, cultural worker, and international lecturer. And an incest and adult rape survivor, she is the producer and director of the critically acclaimed Ford Foundation-funded film, No, the Rape Documentary, and the creator of the Love with Accountability Project. Simmons is in the final stages of preparing her Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse, edited manuscript for publication by AK Press in fall 2019. Simmons is a Just Beginnings Collaborative Fellow and a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is affiliated with the Eveline Jacobs Ortner Center on Violence and Abuse in Relationships. She is also an associate editor of the Feminist Wire and a member of the editorial board of the Feminist Wire Press. She has screened her work, taught university courses, guest lectured, and facilitated workshops across the North American continent and in numerous countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. You can follow her on Twitter at AfroLes and Love with Accountability and Love Accountability. And we'll make sure that we get links to all of that in the text chat for you. But Aisha, I'm so excited and honored that you have taken time to come onto this web conference. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you, and I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation with my cohort members, Sonia and Amita, and all of the participants, and looking forward to a lively conversation about these very difficult topics.
Absolutely. So Aisha, you have control over your slides. So I'd really love if you would share with us and walk us through your work around Love with Accountability.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to just kind of briefly go over, you'll hear again some of the things that were in my bio, but it will set a context for my work. So as Tori shared, that I am the producer and director of No, the Rape documentary, which came out in 2006, and it broke taboos that hid heterosexual rape and sexual assault in African American communities. The film brought together leading and, at the time of filming, emerging African American scholars, theologians, artists, activists, men, women, and survivors to break silences and commit themselves to reshape patriarchal cultures of violence against women in queer communities. No was the beginning of my utilizing multiple approaches to create transformation to end sexual violence. The film's supplemental materials, Breaking Silences, which is a 2-hour video, and Unveiling the Silence, which is an interactive 100-page study guide that's available and downloadable for free, are used in educational institutions and rape crisis centers and other entities across this country and internationally. So I share this information to give background and create a contextual background, I should say, that to emphasize I've been working in this movement since the early 90s. And yet it wasn't until the beginning of 2015 that I was able to cultivate the strength to dig up my child sexual abuse roots. Personally, there's no single event that has defined my life more than what happened to me against my will as a child by my grandfather. And I share this because this is the reality with so many victim survivors, that digging up our roots, our child sexual abuse roots, our sexual violence roots, inevitably leads to questions of love, accountability, and family. The overwhelming majority of us are taught from birth that regardless of any transgression we experience from a family member, we must protect the family at all costs. So the Love with Accountability project was conceived through my own child sexual abuse healing work. About 4 years ago, I began demanding conversations with my divorced human rights activist parents about their silence surrounding my molestation as a child. I started signing every single communique, letter, email, text, Love with Accountability. In doing so, I was emphasizing that my deep love for them could not shield their lack of accountability for the CSA, for the child sexual abuse that I endured for 2 years as a child, and their subsequent year cover-up. So there are approximately 42 million survivors of child sexual abuse in the U.S., and about 90% of those survivors know their abuser. Or harm doer. I really like to say harm doer, other than not perpetrator or, but harm doer. So Love with Accountability is a project whose focus is on tackling the global epidemic of child sexual abuse through transformative storytelling, which utilizes experiences, insights, and perspectives of diasporic Black child sexual abuse survivors and advocates. We survivors often remain silent, protecting the harm doers, who are often family members. The silence around child sexual abuse in the family institution, I believe, plays a direct role in creating a culture of sexual violence in other institutions, religious, academic, activist, political, and professional. Its occurrence, treatment, and research must be highlighted in this current heightened awareness of sexual violence perpetuated on adults. Despite the current survivor-affirming awareness around sexual violence, child sexual abuse, most especially in families, is still a very taboo topic. While the assumption is that child sexual abuse primarily affects girls, boys, transgender, and gender non-binary children are just as prone to be sexually abused in their families. Survivors of color, queer survivors, deaf, hard of hearing, and disabled survivors all carry extra burdens of protecting their families and caregivers at all costs, resulting from the impact of white supremacy, homophobia, autism, and ableism. So this work touches upon the approximately 42 million child sexual abuse survivors in the U.S. and points to the millions of bystanders looking the other way as the abuse happens and covering for the harm doers. There isn't accountability. So Love with Accountability works to address the profound harm that comes, especially for diasporic Black survivors, when the only option for addressing the child sexual abuse harm doer is punishment via incarceration. This, in my opinion, is not the answer to disrupting and ending child sexual abuse. Prisons don't focus on rehabilitation. Instead, they represent modern-day enslavement, as the incarcerated who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and Latinx youth and adults are often raped and degraded by inmates and correctional personnel. Too often, family and community bystanders ignore child sexual abuse, and the prison system does worse, facilitating its continuation. There are many U.S. laws in place to protect victim survivors of child sexual abuse, sexual and domestic violence, but unfortunately, I observe punish and harm more than help. Survived and Punished, the national project to end the criminalization of survivors of domestic and sexual violence, has not only documented this frightening reality, but its members, quote, organized to decriminalize efforts to survive domestic and sexual violence, support and free criminalized survivors, and abolish gender violence, policing, prisons, and deportations. We can think about Brescia Meadows as one example, and many other examples of now some young and then adults who were abused when they were young and serving horrific draconian sentences in defense of themselves for the just really unspeakable harm that they experience. So this is part of, for me, my work with Love with Accountability is like, how do we address these heinous crimes humanely? So like many individuals and collectives and organizations that proceed or are in community with Love with Accountability, it moves beyond solely focusing on harm doer demonization, but also works to understand the conditions, including silent bystander mentality, that allow child sexual abuse to flourish. And then I think, is this Tori or Ashley, do you want to go into about what Love with Accountability means for me here?
Sure. Yeah, so Aisha, I actually, first I just want to thank you for kind of laying out the framework that you've just laid out about your work and how you came to your work with Love with Accountability. And, I think it's really important that when we're thinking about ending child sexual abuse, the only options that are available to address the harm really recreates violence. That's not a good place to be in. So you mentioned Survived and Punished, and so I just wanted to make a quick note that we actually did a podcast with the folks from Survived and Punished. So awesome. We put a link to where people, if they want to learn more about that, they can access that. But I think at this point, so I'd love to do two things. I'd love to hear from our audience what they think when they hear Love with Accountability. What does that mean for you all? Like, what comes to mind? What is that? What does that mean? And then, Aisha, I'd love for you to kind of walk us through what that means for you. Like, what does love with accountability look like? What does that mean for you?
And I want to talk about, how I've been exploring that, in the upcoming slides after that. So, yeah, definitely.
And so we're seeing that folks are starting to type in. And so I think what we'll do, Aisha, is why don't we continue to hear from you, and then we'll come back and we'll do a summary of what folks are saying.
Okay. So that's great. So the project, and let me say all of this is possible because of my fellowship. I just launched in as the Just Beginning Collaborative Fellowship. So all of this work is funded 100% by the JBC Collaborative. And I think that this is important in terms of talking about survivor leadership and what does that look like and how is it possible. So launched in 2016 as a 10-day forum, I curated and edited and published Love with Accountability in the Feminist Wire, which is an online publication. Over 25 diasporic Black survivors, advocates, and one bystander, my mother, spanning gender identity, sexuality, and age, joined me in storytelling that explored what love with accountability looks like when addressing child sexual abuse outside of the criminal injustice system. It is a criminal justice project as well. So on the Love with Accountability website, there are slides of all of the participants in the forum, and what happens is you'll see a quote from their essays that they wrote, and then when you click on their page, then you have the access to the full essay. So I just wanted to highlight some of the quotes from some of the participants in the forum. So since the launch of the project in 2016, I had the opportunity to travel extensively across the U.S., engaging in public and private intergenerational conversations about disrupting and ending child sexual abuse compassionately with predominantly Black and Latinx high school students, racially diverse college students, sexual assault prevention coalitions and providers, and Black clergy through the work of Children of Combahee, founded by Ahmad Green Hayes, who presented in the previous Prevent Connect seminar, and Women Preach, which was founded by Reverend Dr. Valerie Bridgman. So the issues that were raised in Love with Accountability on the forum are being published in an upcoming anthology, and that's going to be published in October 2019, because the power of transformative storytelling to ignite social change is undeniable. So for me, I'm very excited about exploring what Love with Accountability looks like with a wide range of survivor advocates from various communities within the diaspora. So one of the things that, and I credit one of my cohort members, Luz Marquez Binbo, who is a Black Latinx woman, for really honing in that, that Blackness isn't just African American. So that there are folks in the anthology as well as the forum who are Spanish speaking, who are speaking Creole, Patois, and now Akan, a sister from Ghana. So just really kind of looking at under the umbrella of Blackness, right? The breadth of it, and what does it mean for us to address these issues in the context of child sexual abuse, recognizing that the criminal justice apparatus globally has done more harm than good, specifically in communities of color. So how can we address this humanely? For me, it's important to solicit and curate the intergenerational wisdom of other survivors and advocates whose work precedes and is in conversation with mine. I believe that developing the answers for how to end this pandemic will require the brain trust of so many. And so for me, I believe definitely, and as is the case with most of the featured contributors in the forum as well as in the anthology, is that this is personal is political work. It is that we are using our lived experiences. Most of us are engaged in the movements to end sexual violence, to then think about what are the roles that we can play to protect the current and future generations of children. So we were all harmed. We're working on healing. We can't undo the harm that was done, but we can use these experiences to create roadmaps in collaboration with so many, right, about how we can address this pandemic.
Great. So, Aisha, there's a lot of activity in the text chat,
Okay.
which is great.
I'm like looking everywhere.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's so much. So, so folks are saying, so what does love with accountability mean to you? So, to acknowledge that it happened. So love with healthy boundaries. Love means acknowledging and being accountable for when you messed up or crossed the boundary. To validate and support and believe it happened. It means that you may love an individual but still need to be held accountable for their actions, whether those are positive or negative. Let's see, Jenny said holding someone in goodwill while demanding honesty, transparency, and responsibility. Chelsea says, I'm thinking of accountability as coming from love of self, of each other, and of community, and working together to create space for healing and growth. So I see a lot of things about unconditional love, giving people the space to be acknowledged, to be believed. Tori, what's coming up for you in the text chat?
I saw a lot of those same themes, Ashley, around that accountability and belief. And one other thing that I really want to highlight is someone had mentioned something about not having that relationship be static, but moving and growing through the accountability process and having dynamic growth come out of this space of healing. So I really want to thank the person who brought out that comment in the text chat.
Right, and I'm seeing Luz says not to hold the burden alone, but that others who love me will respect boundaries, especially for those of us who are incest survivors and maintaining our family ties. So there's a lot, and people are still typing in, Aisha, but I wanted to just go back to you and see, hearing those responses. What do you think about those responses?
I mean, I feel like cosign. I mean, and I think that's the power of really engaging with others and soliciting the wisdom, because I think it's going to take so many of us, right? Like my work is very focused in communities of African descent, but this is a global pandemic, and that's impacting all communities, right? So for me, I'm moving in the community from which I come, but I want to learn what works in other communities, and are there ways in which there's overlap? And I mean, I think that's really key, and I think that there's this way in which we have to, I think, recognize that this is long distance running, right? That there isn't a quick fix, and know that Sonia will be weighing in on this a lot more based on her powerful work that she does. And so that, and that we have to also, I mean, and I'm speaking as a survivor, so I'm not like, this is not theoretical or whatever, like, see the humanity of all of this involved, right? So the humanity in my grandfather who harmed me, he's now an ancestor, and it doesn't let him off the hook. It doesn't, and if I decide I didn't want to be around, like I didn't go to his funeral, but I also see his humanity. Because I think that when we make people monsters, then it just kind of, it not only does it isolate and alienate, it doesn't create, there isn't space for recognizing that all of us in some form or fashion have caused some form of harm. I'm not talking about sexual harm. And so that as long as we kind of like, oh, he's a monster, then it makes it impossible for us to see other folks who cause harm. I mean, in terms of, my grandfather was married, had a great job, was a provider. If it wasn't for him, my grandmother who had Alzheimer's for 11 years, she would have been in a nursing home. He took care of her around the clock. And he's the same person who molested me. So how do we hold all of that? And I think that we have to move beyond the black-white binary or good-bad binary. Yes, what he did was horrible. And also, what happened to him? I don't think that that is the burden of survivors to have to always hold, because it's about the healing that we have to do. But it is also just kind of like recognizing that throwing someone in prison isn't going to stop sexual violence. It's just not. And I do think that I love that comment around that it's not static and that it's evolving, and also recognizing that my grandfather couldn't have done what he did without support of others, inadvertent, right? So I told my parents they didn't take me out. So it's not just my grandfather, it's also my parents. And so I think that a lot of times we want to focus on just that one person who caused harm, and we need to also look at all of the systems surrounding that allow it to happen. Because if we don't, we really will not move towards eradicating it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aisha. You're getting a lot of, what you're saying seems to be resonating a lot for folks in the audience. So I just wanted you to know that people are, Wendy popped in and said yes with lots of exclamation points. Well, so we want to make sure that everyone has the ability to connect with you, and so we have your slide up that has where folks can find you on Twitter. It looks like Instagram and Facebook, and then your lovewithaccountability.com website. And I know that we're going to come back to you a little bit later on in the web conference to continue having conversations around this, but I just wanted to really thank you for sharing and leading us in this conversation and kind of really putting out some things that I think it's so important as prevention practitioners that we grapple with and that we think about. So just very appreciative to you. And again, I just saw it pop up, family as bystanders is key to ending child sexual abuse. And so it sounds like, people are really in agreement with that and understanding that that's such a key area. So thank you, Aisha.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I look forward to the learning from what Sonia has to share and Amita and to being all of us engaging in dialogue with each other.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so with that, I want to now turn it over to Sonia Shaw, and I'll tell you a little bit about Sonia. And of course, there's so much more to say about each one of our presenters, and so if you follow the links that we're putting in the text chat, you can read their full bios. But Sonia Shaw initiated the Ahimsa Collective in January 2016. She has 20 years experience in social justice education and 10 years experience in restorative justice. She is an associate professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She has trained hundreds of facilitators in trauma healing and restorative justice practices across the U.S. She's worked closely with survivors of violent crimes, people who have committed violence, families impacted by violence, and law enforcement. Central to her core values are creating belonging and beloved community in every aspect of her work and life, and balancing her relationship to self, others, the community, and nature. She is a survivor of sexual abuse and a first-generation immigrant from the northwestern part of India. She speaks at national conferences, colleges, and with media outlets. So Sonia, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm really excited to hear about the work that you have been engaged in as one of the organizations funded through Just Beginnings Collaborative. So first, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna, you should be able to advance your slides, but I'd love to hear about your work and really your take on survivor leadership in this movement to end child sexual abuse.
Absolutely. So thanks everyone for having me, and it was so wonderful and enriching to listen to Aisha's presentation, and I resonate with so much of it. So I guess I would start by saying, just telling a little bit about myself as well, both in the context of the Ahimsa Collective. Ahimsa is a Sanskrit word that just means do no harm, as well as my own sort of personal survivor journey that kind of led into why coming with a restorative, transformative approach to sexual harm with people who have done sexual harm as well as survivors is really, to me, at the center of ending child sexual abuse and sexual harm deeply in multi-generations and not just sort of as a quick fix of recidivism. My journey is such that my parents immigrated from India to the United States. I was sexually abused as a very young child from the ages of 3 to 5 by a caretaker. And I completely blocked that memory out until I was 18, 19 years old. It was my first week of college. I ended up in an incredibly beautiful, supportive college where 4 days into it, finally being out of my environment in a safe place, I kind of had all the recovered memories of what had happened. And then I spent the next many, many years kind of trying to uncover and understand why I had taken all these different turns. I think I grew up in a pretty dark place. I was really afraid of a lot of things. But I found my light through the darkness. And so this work is very near and dear to me. And I'll just give a shout out to like one of my favorite people. 20 years old, I wandered into a rape crisis center at St. Luke's Roosevelt, Mount Sinai. And Louise Kinley was a therapist there, and she took me on as a free client for a year as a 19, 20-year-old, and it absolutely changed my life and helped me to start sort of find that light. In finding that light, I kind of always had a feeling and a wonder of, I wasn't very interested in kind of reaching back and finding the person, but I did always wonder why they did what they did and what it would look like for them, like what had happened in their life and what would it look like, had they had healing or accountability, all the things we're talking about. And because my approach, just like what everybody's been saying on this webinar, what Aisha really put forth around the prison industrial complex is an incredibly racist, incredibly oppressive system, and when our only option is punitive, and as Tori said, the only option we have to address the harm is to recreate the harm. That's not what I would want as a survivor. I wouldn't want to send somebody to prison. I would really want answers. I would want some sense of accountability, and I would want some sense of, like, what are you going to do about it? What's the plan to change? And that's what's really at the heart of restorative justice, right, or restorative approaches, is really the sense of there is another way. So 3 years ago, I started the Ahimsa Collective, and one of the central things that we do and what we've been developing over the last 3 years is actually a restorative approach to sexual harm, and we work directly with people who've done sexual harm across California in different prisons. And it's been quite a journey to get there. So by sexual harm, I mean rape, child sexual abuse, sexual assault, and the sort of different variations of that. And so that there is this sort of other way that we can actually birth, and we've developed, like 120 to 150 hours of working together, and how do we approach transforming harm when people have done it. And it's not an easy thing to talk about. Especially because survivors deserve to be angry and outraged and have not been heard, and that is all true and needs to be true. And if we don't focus on the healing and the accountability of people who've done harm, I don't think we're going to get to the place where we actually break these deep cycles. One of the people in one of our groups said, and he had committed a rape, he said, I committed my rape when I was at the most dehumanized place in my life, and that's how I was able to dehumanize someone else. And this work is all about coming back to our humanity. And I think in that humanity is where the accountability happens. And it's when people are starting to heal that old saying, hurt people, then they're able to be more accountable. So they go together. Healing and accountability go together. And it's really hard to think about, right? Like, as people who might have done harm, when there is like a level of self-worth and self-identity and self-forgiveness, there is more accountability. And I've seen this. I've been doing this work for 10 years with people who've done severe and violent crime. And I want to say one more thing before I jump into this next part, is that one of the things the only other thing that exists out there that's not punitive, while it is in some ways, are kind of the clinical sex offender treatment programs. And while they do a certain kind of job, this approach that's restorative is so much more about relationship and being grounded in non-judgment and love, and then the hard work of accountability. So there's a really big difference when you're grounding something in a humanistic approach to someone, that they weren't born horrible or bad, that they're not monsters, that we hold these multiple truths, that somebody could have been a provider, like Aisha said, and done this harm, and to understand that the system around it has been created such that we incarcerate people who've committed sexual harm and then deem them, sort of pathologize them as sociopaths and monsters, because probably we can't deal with the fact that it's like everywhere in our communities, in our lives, and that 90% of people don't report, right? So it's kind of easier to say these people are demonized as opposed to take a kind of humanistic and a more sort of sociology approach of like everybody has the capacity to change, right? So I'm going to talk for my next time about some really hard stuff, of two things. We have 30 men who have committed sexual harm, and this work is really being birthed from their wisdom of why they did what they did. What do they identify as the causes? Why did I commit a sexual harm? And then what could have been done differently? And I think this is really important for beautiful prevention people that are on the line, because if we don't know directly from them why they did it, how are we going to know what to do to stop it? And then in our world, we know that the wisdom of directly impacted people is one of the most important things to really listen to. And so this is really kind of following that lineage. And I just want to say that the next slides are kind of all trigger warnings, right? So we're talking about like really, really hard things about people who've done sexual harm and why. And they can feel like denial or minimizing or all that stuff, but it's really not intended to do that. It's intended to get at the causes. So I'll just start with the first one. Again, this is all work that's been kind of co-created by 30 men who have committed sexual harm. So one of the things that was said quite frequently was just the male socialization by authority figures. Uncles, fathers, men in authority positions teaching younger men that by words or action that rape, CSA, DV, or violence to women is normal and it's just what we do. There were so many different quotes about, hey, I just watched my uncle do it, and he said, you know, that's what women like, that's what we do. Power, privilege, and entitlement. I did it because I could. I took it and I did whatever I wanted. This from a man who committed child sexual abuse, who was an upstanding citizen in his community, was a white man, had a really good job, and really just named that he did it because nobody stopped him, because he had all the power, he had all the privilege, he had all the entitlement. And, you know, when he has spoken, the C.K. Lewises of the world come to mind, the Kevin Spaceys of the world come to mind. What happens when we have folks that have so much power, so much privilege and entitlement that it actually is a cause to commit things like rape and child sexual abuse because I can, you know, and coupled with a lot of complex causes, right? So I'm not trying to say that there's only one cause. Usually all of these causes are overlapping and multifarious. Of course, there's just a piece of the learned objectification of women, and that first section on the slide is a part of our curriculum where, you know, what we do a lot is help people tease out what are their causative factors, why do they commit their harm, and how can you even trace for yourself how you learned how to objectify a woman. And again, I'm very much coming at this from a kind of heteronormative perspective because most of the men in the groups are. So there were some really interesting stories and sort of perspectives about some men who were either socially awkward growing up or bullied or treated really badly based on race. And they felt like outsiders, and that outsider status felt like it was impossible as a teenager growing up to, like, quote unquote, get the girl. I couldn't get girls was something that was said really frequently. That distance to girls and young women increased as folks had more exposure to pornography, had more exposure to drugs and alcohol, kind of started leading towards a low point in their lives, until like the distance between the self and the female body became further and further and more objectified until a rape happened, right? Until they committed a rape. And so that was kind of like a common causative story. Like I said before, just this sense of like really owning being at a low point in life, being at the highest point of addiction and the lowest point in life. One man said, I'd been high for 48 hours. I hadn't slept. I was either going to drive off a bridge and kill myself or commit the sexual assault. Exposure to inappropriate sexual experiences, right? We know with all the research that there's no direct connection between being a male survivor of sexual abuse and committing sexual harm, but many of the men in our groups are survivors of child sexual abuse, of child-on-child sexual touching, of exposure to pornography, of witnessing sex acts. And they all have said that it's really, really difficult to tease it out and to pinpoint kind of what is what, and that there's a really complex relationship for them about having been a victim and then being a victimizer. And so on that note, what some of them said was just this notion of revenge. Some male survivors of CSA talked about wanting revenge, this extreme jealousy of children, and that they also had access to in a relationship with a child. So they found themselves as an adult in a situation with having a girlfriend who had a kid, or having a child around that they had access to, and moving into a moment of child sexual abuse because they saw that happiness in that child and they wanted to take it away. I had my childhood stolen from me by CSA. So committing an act of CSA was out of revenge, jealousy, or to take away another child's happy childhood. I had the belief, I'm sorry, I spelled that wrong, that abusing someone else would make me feel better versus I was reenacting my own trauma. I wanted someone else to suffer and feel the pain that I was feeling. Power and control were taken away from me as a child, and sex was a weapon. So I did the same thing, turned around and used sex as a weapon. And then the next piece was around, again, male survivors who had done also CSA and rape, talking about validation and loss of identity as one of their causative reasons. That one said, I got validation from the man who sexually abused me, so I sought that validation through inappropriate sexual acts with others. And really talked about like the piece of validation. And another man talked about that he had a moment, he was sexually abused by an older sister caretaker, and when he told his uncle just kind of patted him on the back and said, great job, and then exposed him to pornography, and it kind of led him deeply into the sense of creating an identity through doing inappropriate sexual acts. So, of course, like patriarchy, man box, and male culture, toxic masculinity, right? Being taught not to ask for consent, the dehumanization of women in culture, deep fear of rejection that is coming from that kind of sense of I'm a man who has to know all the answers. And this is a hard one. I'm supposed to know all the answers and not being able to ask for help. It can sound like it's minimizing, but many of the men in our group said that just when in male culture, like I'm not ever supposed to say that I don't know something or that something's wrong. And if I can't ever like tell anybody that I'm not okay or ask for help, then how am I going to talk about the abuse that I'm doing? I'm not going to go into the sexual addiction piece because I think that's something people know a lot about, but that was also another piece. And then I think just making the distinction between also exposure to pornography and witnessing inappropriate sexual acts and then being like a male survivor of child sexual abuse. Those have kind of a slightly different feel. I hope everybody's okay. I know I just ran through like a lot of hard stuff.
No, so that was a lot.
That was a lot.
Fascinating though, and there's actually a question from the audience. Tasneem asked, did you talk to people who were abusers but had not been abused themselves? So I guess just trying to get an understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are people that have been abusers or have done rape that are not abusers themselves, right? And it's almost like, in a strange way, easier to say, oh, I was victimized, so that's why I did it, right? And it's much harder for those men, and I can only speak to men, who weren't abused to try to understand why they did it. But like I was saying, there are all these other factors, like just being like incredibly powerful and having a lot of privilege, and feeling like afraid of rejection, and having being a stepfather who, has stepdaughters and one is rejecting you, and you think you can do whatever you want, and so you move into CSA in order to not be rejected, right? Like, so there's like some stories like that, and there's no like one size fits all, right? It's really a process, like, of each person finding their own story, and by finding it, it's like by doing it. I would tell you, as a person who's facilitated this process, like, I have listened to so many things where if I'm really being myself, I would just like want to tear my hair out and be like, how could you? But there is a sense of showing up in unconditional, like, sort of love. And that I see your humanity even when you tell me the hardest thing, that allows for the hardest things to be said. And then it's not about letting the person off the hook. It's saying, and, yeah, that had a huge impact. And like, what does accountability look like? But that comes with a lot of trust that's built in those kinds of relationships. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have some other, I'll go maybe 4 more minutes. Is that okay? And just share what could have helped me stop the harm. This is sort of a little bit, lighter. And really helpful from a preventionist perspective, right, to think about. It's kind of what we already know when people are talking about family members and bystanders helping, but it's kind of broken down into their words that I think can be really, really juicy and really helpful. So a lot of talk about mothers, psychiatrists, and people, caregivers listening, not silencing me, and being trained to help me. So one man said, when the abuse happened by this big guy, my mother's boyfriend, I told her the first thing she did was, tell me never to say that again. She silenced me because we had nowhere else to go. We needed him for a place to live. She passed that on as a coping skill, and then what did I do? I stuffed it all down there until one day I committed the same crime. When my uncle raped me, I reported it to the police. I even went to the police station, but when I came back, nothing happened. He was still there. The next month, I raped my victim. There was a story of a man who talked about, he did actually a series of rapes, and he said after, and this is like really heartbreaking, after my first attempted rape, I looked up who to call in the yellow pages. I found this rape crisis number to call, but the person on the other end didn't know what to say, how to process what I was telling her, and they didn't understand. After I told my first psychologist, he said, man, I wish that I was the one on your first call. I could have really helped you, right? So what would have happened if that person on the other end really understood what this person was saying? When I told my first psychologist, he looked at me in horror. He was just a paper pusher and didn't know what to do. So I was silent after that, and I didn't tell anyone for decades. So clearly that, a safe place to say, I really messed up when I did the act, and I don't know where there's a quote in there, and creating a central hub, right? So this sense of by telling my whole family would be taken away, this led me to the big secret that could never be talked about, that turned into the monster, right? And so there's this sense of, like, Germany has this, I can't remember the name of it, right, an anonymous place that people can go and say this is what they're doing and get help. And there's a sense that, if we're really, really talking about, even though we really want them to be accountable and we really want people to stop, like, no one's going to say that they're doing it unless they have an anonymous way to say, not no one, but people are often not going to say that they are doing it and have a place to actually get help. And it's kind of crass to think about, somebody could actually, like, call into a hotline and say I need help and never have kind of accountability or any kind of responsibility. But if we do want to end cycles of sexual violence, we have to really think about this as like a real possibility. Professionals focusing on my behavior as a kid as opposed to the underlying cause. So, Aisha talked about Survived and Punished. You guys did a webinar series on it, but just want to reiterate that also there's a beautiful, beautiful report called the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline about young girls, young Black and brown girls that are sexually abused and then targeted and through punitive measures. Also, I don't know if people know this, but when you're raped in prison, what happens is you, as the survivor, are put in solitary confinement, not the person who did the harm. You are actually targeted, as the survivor says, never goes reported. And this quote, I think, really says it a lot, is when I was in elementary school, a boy in my school touched my private parts, and so then I just turned around and beat him up. The next thing I know, I'm put in handcuffs and taken away, and then a psychologist makes me draw. None of them knew or asked what had happened to me. That this boy touching me triggered my survivor story. I just, caregivers going to bat for me and also healing themselves. So what happens when you tell a caregiver and they have their own survivor story triggered and they're not healed by something or there's something else going on? I did some work with some indigenous communities a few years ago, and Faith Tate of the Nigsa Nation has often said, if we are unhealed, what are we passing down? Or the need to heal our elders so that like when caregivers are hearing things, they're also able to receive them because they're also doing healing. Of course, the transformation of rape culture and the degradation of women from early childhood to adulthood. I actually think this is like the biggest thing ever in like every realm, from schools to community, like teaching about patriarchy, objectification of women, internalized homophobia, and then the other side, healthy male identity, healthy sexuality, healthy relationships. And then the last thing I would say is the sense of healing male survivorship and taking accountability for sexual harm I caused. So from the people who did both, who did one and were also victimized, like really not belittling male survivorship, because normalizing it is another way to groom men into male culture, somebody said. There's a really great website, it's called 1 in 6, and it talks about these 6 myths about boys who are sexually abused, and we've done exercises around this where you really break down these myths and then understand how these things that happen to you are really real. So boys can't be sexually abused is a myth. It was his fault. Sexual abuse is less harmful to males. Only gay men sexually abuse boys. Being a male survivor means you're gay. Males abused by a female got lucky. That's a really common one. And male survivors will abuse others, right? So making it clear that there's no correlation between the two. And then finally is for people who did the harm and were also victimized, is being allowed to have space to heal the survivorship while being accountable for the harm we caused, exactly what Aisha was saying. To be able to do both simultaneously, that heal as a part of the survivor work is also part of the harm work. And then, like I said, what we really do more than anything is create a supportive, restorative, humanistic, non-judgmental space. And I'll just end with this, that what one of the men in our group said is like, other programs in prison will stop us from recidivating, sure. I won't commit the crime again, but this program fundamentally changed who I am. And I think that's where we're going, is to really break deep cycles of violence. By coming from a really relational perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. I mean, you took us through so much. And so, thank you for that. And I think there's a lot of conversation happening in the text box. And so you might want to pop over there and take a look. But so there's a question that I wanted to come back to. And it was from Maria. And Maria asks, when you were talking about the factors in why these men committed a sexual harm, Maria's wondering how much overlap did you find between all of those factors?
Yeah, a lot. It's usually, like I was saying, it's not one thing. It's like 5 things that happen. But, trying to break it down into sort of manageable parts. I will say what's the most common is people having drug addiction or alcohol addiction and being at a low point in their lives, right? Like feeling that was, a really, really big piece of the difference between doing harm and not doing harm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Jenny just said, loved your statement, healing and accountability go together.
Yeah, sweet.
And Sonia, I think another conversation that's coming up is just the fact that there's not a lot of places for folks to seek help, right? If they are committing harm, if they're thinking about committing harm, and so where does that kind of responsibility lie? I remember there was an NPR episode a couple years ago about I think it was a teenager who was having, had not committed harm but was having these thoughts and really, Jenny said tarred and feathered. We'll try to find a link to that, but was really having a hard time finding help. And so I'm wondering if you've found that as well in your work.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the thing is that, I mean, and it, you know, we're in such a nascent place where we can actually even think about the humanity of people who've done sexual harm. And if we can't do that, how are they going to reach out? Who are they going to reach out to, right? So there's a place where, like, can we be all about the healing of survivors, all about the support of survivors, all about helping survivors, and can we be about, like, helping people who've done the harm, you know, break those cycles and also heal themselves. And I mean, living in a 200% non-binary reality that we can actually do both of those things at the same time. But it requires us to change, like, so much of broader culture in order to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Sonia.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that. And I want to see, Anita, are you on the line?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. I thought I heard someone pop on. So I'm so glad that you were able to join us. And so Sonia and Aisha, we are planning on coming back to you all to have a discussion. But at this point, I want to welcome you all and welcome Anita Swadin, founder and director of Mere Memoirs. And Anita, I know you're on the road, so thank you so much for calling in. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the background noise. I am sitting in an airport as I literally just got off a plane, so I'm going to do my best here, and I do have the slides up in front of me.
Oh, okay, great. Well, we are just happy to have you here, and I'm also seeing a text chat question on the screen, so I do want to give our audience a chance to respond to this. And there's been a lot of great comments already, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think learning from survivors and learning from those who have caused harm can advance prevention work. So if you'll let us know. I'm going to go ahead and, Anita, I'm going to read your bio because I want people to get a sense of, if they're not familiar with our work, and I'm sure many are, to get a sense of where you're coming from. So, and let me move to the slide so folks can see you. So Anita Swadin is an educator, storyteller, activist, and consultant dedicated to fighting interpersonal and institutional violence against young people. Their commitments and approach to this work stem from their experiences as a genderqueer, femme-queer woman of color, daughter of immigrants, and years of abuse by their parents, including 8 years of rape by their father. They are a frequent speaker at colleges, conferences, and community organizations nationwide, and a consultant with over 15 years of experience in nonprofits serving low-income immigrant and LGBTQ youth of color in Los Angeles and New York City. Anita has been publicly out as a survivor of child sexual abuse since interning at the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Violence Against Women in 1997. Anita is also a published author whose writing has been featured on the Feminist Wire, the Huffington Post, and in the anthologies Dear Sister, Letters from Survivors of Sexual Violence, and Queering Sexual Violence. Anita holds a Master's in Public Administration from New York University, where they were a Catherine B. Reynolds Fellow in Social Entrepreneurship and a BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. And we'll go ahead and put a link to where folks can get your full bio. But Anita, we're going to move your slides for you, but we'd love to hear, I know you've been on previous Prevent Connect web conferences talking about survivor leadership and really the importance and necessity of letting survivors lead the movement to end child sexual abuse. And so we'd love for you to talk us through your work with Mere Memoirs and how you see survivor leadership as being absolutely foundational to any movement to end sexual abuse.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think the most fundamental thing about the insights that you get when you actually elevate survivor leadership are understanding how much the systems that are currently set up for helping survivors actually are causing harm in the lives, particularly of survivors at the most vulnerable intersections of oppression. So the work I've been doing with Mirror Memoirs, I've been traveling the United States for the past year and a half, 2 years, and I've recorded 60 stories from LGBTQ people of color who were raped or sexually assaulted in childhood. And I've recorded 60 of those stories across 15 states. And what you learn by listening to that specific population, of which I'm also a member, is how much the state is actually perpetrating sexual violence through the use of prisons, juvenile detention systems, the foster care system, mental health hospitals, and police violence especially. And that really doesn't get talked about. It's not in people's consciousness unless you're specifically paying attention to the narratives of survivors. And I think for me, what that really means is the way we think about sexual violence, and especially ending it and healing it, needs to encompass that reality of state violence as a perpetrator as well. And we would totally be missing the boat if our strategies and our policies were only shaped by non-survivors.
Mm. Great. And do you want us to move your slides, or?
Let me see if I can do it. Did that work?
Yep, it does.
Okay, great. This is hilarious. I'm literally like sitting with my back against a pole in the airport, but we're just going to go for this, everyone. So I want to talk a little bit about where we get the current policies around ending sexual violence, right, what the history of that work has been. And I should name that, grassroots work to end sexual violence really has its roots in Black and Indigenous communities, especially Black feminist communities. There was the Combahee River Collective in the 1960s, which started right outside of Boston by Black feminists, and especially queer Black feminists, responding to a wave of Black women being kidnapped and raped and murdered without any state response. And so that's where we get a lot of grassroots activism pushing for the funding of domestic violence shelters, of rape crisis centers. It wasn't the only place, but that's not the only example. There were like several grassroots attempts by women of color, and especially Black women and Indigenous women, given the foundation of this country, to really respond to violence against women in their communities that the state was not actually doing anything about. And then as we started to finally get funding through things like the Violence Against Women Act, the Office of Victims of Crime, et cetera, we started to see a different victim be held in the public imagination and in lawmakers' imagination when shaping public policies and funding organizations that are responding to sexual violence and domestic violence. And so this list was my attempt to really encapsulate who that victim is that is in the hearts and minds of most lawmakers. And we find that it's usually mothers, cisgender women, heterosexual women, white women, able-bodied women, women who are citizens or green card holders, and adult women. And then obviously the question becomes then who is left out. And I touched on this when you asked about why I think it's important to put survivors' voices in the middle. It's because the public policy that we have, the laws that we have, the penalties that we have are only going to be as good as our understanding of the stories of what survivors' realities are, right? So based on the current imagination of who a victim is, we have Megan's Law, which is the National Sex Offender Registry, which was responding, of course, to the rape and murder of a young white girl who had been harmed by someone who had been a known sex offender, but it was before the registry was created. And what that has actually led to has been mass criminalization of everyone from disproportionately juveniles and especially Black boys and men. There's a woman named Nicole Pittman who is a colleague of mine and Aisha and Sonia's who's actually done a lot of work on this issue, listening to survivors who have been harmed by the sex offender registry. And she interviewed 500 people across the United States who were put on the sex offender registry as children and found that 100% of them had been victims in the child welfare system before they were ever offenders and never received treatment or care and were simply criminalized through the registry. So there's a danger when we only center a certain kind of survivor. Similarly with the Sexual Assault Survivors' Rights Act, I know that there were a lot of people claiming the passage of that act in the outgoing Obama administration in 2016 as a big victory because of its focus on rape kit testing, and that was actually led by a Vietnamese American woman, Amanda Nguyen, who was a victim of rape in college. But I think what you see when you put money into the testing of rape kits is an expansion of the prison system, right? The reason to put more federal funding into testing rape kits is so that ostensibly we can prove the culpability of more rapists and therefore expand incarceration and the penalties of incarceration. So I want to talk about then who is left out, who is hurt by this. And if you could forward the next slide, for some reason my arrows just went away. So this is just a quote that I love from Chimamanda Adichie. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it from her TED Talk, The Single Story Creating Stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They only make one story become the only story. And of course, we know the stories that I've just shared around Megan Kenka and Amanda Nguyen, it's not that they're untrue, it's just that they're too limited when we talk about the entire scope of sexual violence. So Mirror Memoirs, as I said, really focuses on transgender, gender nonconforming, and queer people of color. So I want to talk specifically about sexual violence and transgender people. This is a population that is disproportionately victimized beginning in childhood. We know that 1 in 2 transgender individuals are sexually abused or assaulted at some point in their lives, and 72% of those people are assaulted beginning in childhood. It's an incredibly high number when you compare it to the statistics we have of 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. That really focuses more on a cisgender population coming out of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. I also want to point out that 15% of transgender individuals are sexually assaulted while they're in police custody or jail. It's actually 32% when you're talking about Black transgender people. And 5 to 9% of transgender survivors have been sexually assaulted by police officers directly. So this really raises the issue of not being able to rely on the state as a solution, because the state itself, or the representatives of the state, be they prison guards or police officers, are really the ones causing harm to transgender people, and especially Black transgender people and other transgender people of color. My internet keeps kicking me off, so if you could forward again, and then maybe just tell me what the slide is. Sorry.
Okay, now we're on the what about children who is vulnerable slide.
Great. So what I really want to point out here is that there is a study that was released in 2012 and was actually lifted up again in the Journal of American Medical Association very recently about gender nonconformity as a risk factor. So I think in our field we talk a lot about gender-based violence, and that has led us to focus almost exclusively on cisgender women and girls. But when you look at the data, what we're starting to understand is that children who are gender nonconforming, meaning that they're a boy assigned male at birth, and so their family thinks that they're a boy, but they actually are feminine in some way, or they're assigned female at birth, and are masculine in some way. What we're finding is those children are up to 6 times likelier to experience rape or sexual assault in childhood, and especially it's the male assigned at birth children, the ones who are assigned the gender of being a boy, who are actually raped or sexually assaulted at the highest rate, up to 6 times likelier. So I think this is really important in terms of how we think about who a victim is, who a survivor is. I also want to talk about street violence and the fact that we know there's been a lot of dialogue in recent years about homeless youth being disproportionately LGBTQ. What we don't really talk about is the fact that 54% of them have indicated abuse in their home was an important factor contributing to the reason they left home, in addition to family rejection. So we know that queer kids, transgender kids, gender nonconforming kids are especially vulnerable. And then, of course, I think it's important to note what you all, I'm sure, already know, that in this political climate, undocumented kids are also very vulnerable, especially very unlikely to report if they are being victimized at home. Institutionalized youth, this is again just me trying to point out what I'm hearing in the stories of their memoirs, is that the institutions themselves are often a site of harm, especially for youth who are in mental health hospitals or in juvenile detention centers. They're often being raped or sexually assaulted by the guards in those institutions. And so what this brings me to in Mirror Memoirs, what I'm trying to do with this project is really think about not only just survivor leadership, but which survivors, right? Because if we just continue to lift up survivors, Megan Kenka's a survivor too, or a victim in her case. Amanda Wynn is, of course, a survivor, but that doesn't get at the issue of the state violence that really comes up in Mirror Memoirs. And so I've tried to put intersectionality into practice through this project. And we know that means looking at the people who experience all of these multiple oppressions at once. So if you could go to the next slide, what I've tried to do with Mirror Memoirs is actually put sexual violence into the diagram of intersectionality, understanding that people who don't experience sexual violence are living with privileges, right? We often know that sexual violence causes disabilities based on trauma, like complex PTSD. I myself live with complex PTSD. And how do we find an even more complicated picture of what healing needs to look like and what prevention needs to look like when we understand the vulnerability of living at these multiple intersections? Sorry, my internet keeps kicking me off, so if you could tell me what the next slide is, that'd be great.
You're on your first of two Mirror Memoirs slides.
Okay, perfect. So Mirror Memoirs, I have the same fellowship grant as Aisha and Sonia, and that has allowed me to create this oral history project. It's really an organizing project, but starting with our storytelling. And like I said, I've collected 60 stories across 15 states of LGBTQI people of color. The I stands for intersex, across 15 different states in the U.S. We've also hosted 2 national convenings, one in 2017 and one in 2018. And I'm actually in Detroit right now to host another convening at Creating Change, which is the largest LGBT conference in the country, sponsored by the National LGBT Task Force. So Aisha and myself and 2 of our other colleagues in the fellowship will be the main stage plenary talking about survivors at this vulnerable intersection, and then we'll have a healing space for up to 400 people of color who have experienced sexual violence. So it's really exciting that the work is starting to get us to gather in person, because what we're finding is that it's in person that a lot of the healing can happen through mirroring. We know we have mirror neurons in our brain. We know that dopamine gets released when you feel seen and heard and witnessed and understood. So we're trying to just lean into the natural healing tendencies or gifts or potential that we all have in our brain wiring. And I've done a lot of public education talks as well. This year, we're going to be focusing on dissemination. It's the last year of our fellowship, and so it's a train-the-trainer model, so we will be having smaller convenings with people who share their story in the archive who would like to be trained in the model, how to collect more stories and how to conduct trainings and workshops themselves. There's also some advocacy mandates, I would say, coming out of the archive. For example, we're starting to look at mandated reporting as a source of harm, and working with the national organization Reliance to start doing surveys of service providers who have seen mandated reporting either cause harm or fail a survivor, and thinking about what else could we do policy-wise to support young people, what kind of education programs could we put in place so that there's more discussion about rape culture and childhood rape specifically in places like schools and doctors' offices, et cetera. We're also coding the stories with the help of a Dartmouth professor to be able to write a report on some of our main learnings and the trends, and then look for more artistic projects like a podcast and an art exhibit coming towards the end of the year and into 2020. I want to talk a little bit, as I'm wrapping up, about survivor leadership, right? What does it mean not only to study the survivors at the intersection of Mirror Memoirs, but to actually empower them to be the ones leading the trainings, to be the consultants, to be the public speakers, to be the leaders of organizations that are set to help survivors heal? And some of the obstacles that we have in the field right now, in the anti-violence field, I do a lot of talks at coalitions and at rape crisis centers and large anti-domestic violence organizations. And what I hear again and again is what we've created through the use of government grants to fund our work is this culture of professionalization. And I've worked in the industry myself that really starts to mirror the corporate world in many ways. And that world tells us we are somehow less professional if our wounds are showing. We are somehow less professional if we admit that we live with the disability of PTSD, or if we ourselves are survivors. And this is sort of antithetical to this sort of natural healing circle wiring that we all have, right? Because it makes us less trustworthy in some ways to survivors. It makes us more clinical. And also like really denies the fact that most of us who are doing work to end sexual violence are there because we personally or someone very close to us is a survivor. So I hear again and again from people on the front lines, I want to be creating a culture of survivor leadership, and I don't know how to do that. And for me, the first step is really undoing internal culture in our organization that stigmatizes and pathologizes the reality of being a survivor, and fights against ableism as well, right? When you have a disability like PTSD, you need to think about setting up the survivor leaders who are in your program or running your organization for support with more flexible timelines, with bigger teams, not having one person in charge of the same task all the time. These are things I take into account with Mirror Memoirs. For example, our research coding team consisted of 7 people of color, most of whom were transgender, all of whom were queer or transgender, all of whom had been raped as children, coding the 60 stories into an academic archive using a very academic software called Atlas TI. And we did that by making sure that we had rituals before and after the start of a coding day, such as meditating together or taking a hike together in the woods or burning sage, checking in about our feelings, checking in about our triggers for that day, and making sure that no one was coding more than 2 stories a day. So making sure that your team is big enough to really handle a workload that's not going to destabilize anyone. But what you get by empowering survivors that way is a unique lens. They know what to look for in the data that a non-survivor would perhaps not even think to see. So it's been really transformative in this project to center survivor leadership in that way. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Yes. You're now on what survivor leadership offers.
Great. So when you have survivor leadership, as I said, I think you have more space for the full truth to emerge. In Mirror Memoirs, that has meant being able to see the reality of state violence. And then strategies to end sexual violence are actually based on reality, not just theory of what might help survivors, but it's actually survivors telling you what's going to help them in a critical mass of voices. And we see other examples of empowering the leadership of people directly affected in a lot of other movements with a lot of other issues that used to be thought of as intractable, as issues that would never be solved, such as reproductive justice, HIV and AIDS, and LGBT rights movement. So I think we have some good examples of how to actually follow the leadership of people who are most affected. This is a picture here from one of our convenings, our very first National Mirror Memoirs convening. This is not even everyone who attended, but these are the folks who were comfortable being photographed. And this was after 2 days of nonstop talking about our stories of being raped as children, being sexually assaulted as children, thinking about policy advocacy, thinking about barriers in the field, thinking about what our visions are for healing. And what strikes me the most about after 2 days of that work is the fact that everybody is smiling. Everybody looks so joyful and just so happy to be together. And to me, this is really the magic that happens when you let survivor leadership emerge, is that people are able to put that fourth wall down, right? Something that we've been told our entire lives is never okay to talk about, that we have to keep hidden, that we have to be ashamed of because it happened to us. Putting that down allows this joy of connection to come through. And I think because this violence is so isolating, it is in our connection and our honesty with each other that we do begin to heal. I want to point out, in addition to Aisha's work and Sonia's work and my work, we're part of a cohort in which most of us are survivors of color, and we're all leading really amazing projects. And so you can get more information about that on justbeginnings.org. And then here's the contact information for Mirror Memoirs.
Oh, thank you so much, Anita. I wanted to share, I'm not sure if you can see the text chat, but what you were saying is really resonating with folks. And Natalie said that the culture of professionalization discouraging survivor leadership has been on my mind lately. And Mary said, I would like to echo how important survivor-led leadership needs to be, being trauma-informed for clients, but abusive to staff is a very common phenomenon in our field, unfortunately. And I think that, you know, many people probably are thinking of the ways that survivors' voices are silenced and not, you know, And so what does that mean as folks who are doing prevention when we know that a norm that really allows sexual violence to exist is silence? And so how we're recreating those conditions within our own communities and organizations. So we, Anita, we have linked to some of the other places that you have done work that folks can access online. So the last web conference that you were on, if folks want to hear more about the work with Mirror Memoirs. And I just want to thank you so much for joining even in the midst of your travel.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, so we only have a couple of minutes, and I think we had hoped to have a little bit more time with you all. And I think that, we're going to try to find a way to still do that maybe outside of this web conference. But as we start to close, to wind down this web conference, and it's been a lot. There's been a lot of great conversation, and I mean, hearing about the work from the three of you has been so important. But I'm wondering if you all, and Anita, I think that you touched on this a lot right now, but just to kind of put this up for conversation for the three of you, what trends do you see that are happening, whether it's in an agency, an organization, or the larger movement to end sexual abuse, that are really not supportive of survivor leadership? So that's one part. And then the second part is, what would it look like to truly center, uplift, and support survivors, and particularly survivors of color and LGBTQIA survivors and survivors of color and their leadership? So does anyone want to weigh in on that? It's kind of a big question.
This is Aisha. I'd like to start, and I'll be very mindful because I know we don't have a lot of time. I think there are several things. Like, one of the things that I remember talking, about with Sonia and Amita, as well as other members in our cohort, is like, we can't even imagine being able to do this work in under a lot of other institutional umbrellas. One of the things that I've experienced, having had the opportunity to present at a lot of coalitions over the years before this fellowship, is really kind of almost a resistance to naming that I'm a survivor, that it's almost kind of viewed as like, no, that's personal stuff, and we're here to help survivors. But it's like almost like naming that you're a survivor is like distracts from the work. I mean, I think things have shifted in our current environment of where a lot of people are saying that they're survivors, post the kind of Me Too explosion in terms of, as we know, the mainstream, definitely founded by a Black woman, Tarana Burke, and was doing a lot of work prior to that, but in terms of when the whole national landscape, that there's that, and then, what happened with Dr. Ford. So people, it is more acceptable, but over years, I definitely experienced a lot, like, you could not talk about your survivor side. It was like that meant that you couldn't be objective. And I would offer that it is precisely as a survivor that I can, that I have insight and wisdom to do this work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aisha.
I can piggyback on that to your question about how to better serve LGBTQI survivors. I mean, very few agencies are actually trans inclusive. For example, just to be frank, I think that a lot of cisgender women who were harmed by a cisgender man, and that includes myself. When I was younger, I thought I was cisgender before understanding non-binary. I think a lot of us have a fear of certain anatomy, and to be just even more blunt, we think that sexual violence is associated with a penis, but that erases a lot of people on both sides of the equation, right? In Mirror Memoirs, we hear a lot from male-assigned people who are transgender women who had multiple perpetrators beginning at very young ages in their life, continuing to their adulthood today. They're really hunted And they are the population in the United States that experiences rape and murder at a higher rate than any other gendered population. So we're leaving transgender women out when they actually are the ones most in need of help when we equate sexual violence with a penis. In addition, there's a whole number of people in Mirror Memoirs who were raped or sexually assaulted by a cisgender woman. It's a very uncomfortable fact that we don't want to deal with, that women also commit rape towards children. I've heard from people who are raped by their mothers, by their female babysitters, by their older female cousin, etc. And there are some sensational news headlines around this, such as the teacher who impregnated, who got impregnated by raping her 12-year-old male student, but they don't really make mainstream, they don't break through the mainstream imagination of who a survivor is and who a perpetrator is. And I think it's been a really important couple of years for advancing consciousness about cisgender women who are harmed by cisgender men and cisgender girls who are harmed by cisgender men, but we're still leaving a lot of people out, and I'm excited for us to broaden the lens about who's included in our movements to end sexual violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add just one other thing, which is just, there's a way, as a person who also is in a, organization and kind of the person in charge, although we don't work in a hierarchy, we're all 5 of us are people of color. 3 of us are actually survivors and 2 are formerly incarcerated on our staff. And as our bigger network, it even increases, right? And there's a way that organizations have a lot of cognitive dissonance around really self-examination and self-reflection about being hey, we do this work, but then nobody is reflected, or very few people are reflected on the staff, or they don't have decision-making power or leadership, right? So I think there's kind of a whole deconstruction of power and what we're trying to do and my relationship to agency and people and community that is so necessary in all of our work. And I feel like I have to do it constantly all the time, just in myself. Am I doing the right thing? Did I do too much of a heavy hand? Did I do this? Did I do that? Without that sense of self-reflection, I'm not sure how we would support survivor leadership, survivors of color, people of color, all of that being sort of at the center, having leadership kind of in this movement.
Thank you, Sonia. Yeah, I feel I'm just really appreciative to you all taking time to weigh in on that and offer your insight and wisdom and experiences. And, I think that this web conference has probably piqued a lot of things that folks were either thinking about or, had also experienced. And so I really hope that we can continue this conversation. It's hard to have these kinds of conversations in the confines of 90 minutes, right? I mean, these are big issues, and there's so much to hear and to think about. And so, we really encourage you all to continue the conversations in your own agencies. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the text chat, and we can work to get you answers somehow. We are, unfortunately, out of time today. And Wendy, I see your question asking what advice you have for, or encouragement to offer survivors when encountering adversity. And so I see Sonia's answering, and we'll see if other folks want to text in some tips or some words of wisdom. But I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, and again, just thank you all in the audience for joining us and for having these conversations. It was a pretty, heavy topic today to talk about. And so thank you to our presenters for sharing your work and sharing your wisdom and for being here to start these conversations and for sharing your stories as well. And knowing that we're all doing this work because of survivors. So thank you. Thank you all. We're going to leave the text chat open for a couple more minutes to let you all respond or say any last remarks, but I do want to go ahead and close out the audio portion of today. We did record this session, and so we will make it available in the coming days. You can get all of the PowerPoint slides now, and we will also take out people's names from the text chat and then make that transcript available in case there were links and resources that you weren't able to get. But thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on another Prevent Connect web conference. Aisha, Sonia, Amita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.